My name is Melissa Rosen, and I want to thank you again for joining Sharsheret for an important conversation about positivity and cancer. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items to share. I want to thank our sponsors for today's webinar, which enable us to continue offering such meaningful programs. Thank you to AZI, GSK, Merck, CGen, and the Sigmund and Edith Blumenthal Memorial Fund. And of course, I want to thank our collaborating partner, Cancer Support Community, for working with Sharsheret to enhance support to all those impacted by breast and ovarian cancer. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on Sharsheret's website along with a transcript. Participants' faces and names will not be a part of that recording. I do want to say that we received a good number of really important, meaningful questions through the registration process. As questions arise during today's presentation, please use the chat box and we will address them during the Q&A at the end of the webinar. As a reminder, Sharsheret has been providing telehealth services to the breast and ovarian cancer communities for 20 years. Because cancer is so much more than simply a physical experience. In addition to our many formal programs to help women and their families navigate different aspects of the cancer experience, I want to remind you that our clinical social workers are available every day, every weekday from 9 to 5 in every time zone for one-on-one support. They can answer questions, connect you to appropriate resources, allow you to vent on a particularly difficult day, and so much more. And as always, and as with every one of our services, these are completely free and completely confidential. As we move into the webinar itself, I also want to remind you that Sharsheret is a national not-for-profit cancer support and education organization, and does not provide any medical advice or perform any medical procedures. The information provided by Sharsheret, by today's speaker, is not a substitute for medical advice or treatment for a specific medical condition. You should not use this information to diagnose or treat a health problem, and always seek the advice of your physician or a qualified healthcare provider with any questions you might have regarding your condition. We are so very fortunate to have our speaker with us today. Kelly Hendershot is a licensed clinical social worker and is the Senior Director of Program at Cancer Support Community. She serves as the lead liaison for patient and family programming across Cancer Support Community's growing network of affiliates and healthcare partners. She ensures that programming is effectively implemented throughout the network and meets the quality standards that are a part of their 40-year tradition as a relentless ally for patients. Prior to joining CSC, Kelly was the program director for Gilda's Club Quad Cities. Kelly has said, what began as a need for support through my husband's cancer diagnosis and death grew into a strong passion of ensuring that others never have to face cancer alone. So you know that she is absolutely dedicated to her mission. Kelly, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Melissa. So I'm happy to be here today to be talking about this why can't I stay positive conversation. I think it's probably all resonated with all of us at one point in our lives. We just need to be real with our feelings, but somebody around us is wanting us to stay positive. So we'll be diving into that, but just real briefly, I wanted to share the mission of Cancer Support Community. So like Sharsheret, we are a nonprofit. We're a global organization whose mission is to ensure that all people impacted by cancer are empowered by knowledge, strengthened by action, and sustained by community. So we are headquarters here in Washington, D.C. I'm out of my home office with you today, but we have 50 markets across the globe. So we're primarily in the United States and Canada, but have some outreach around the globe as well. We offer educational programs, support groups, healthy lifestyle activities, social connection opportunities, and much, much more to anyone who's impacted by cancer. So the person diagnosed, family member, friends, all the way through bereavement. Just have a few disclosures for you. These slides were created by the cancer support community. We have an award-winning educational series called Frankly Speaking About Cancer. This is one of those toolkits that is put together for psychosocial support reasons. But this content was developed independently with some outside review from psychosocial experts. CSC, our organization, had final control over all the content that you will see in this program. And again, I am from our headquarters location. When you hear CSC, you often hear Gilda's Club. We are all one happy family organization. Our affiliates either go by the name Gilda's Club or Cancer Support Community. So just to give you an overview, I'm going to do a little bit of stage setting. We'll be talking about depression in cancer, grief in cancer, resilience in cancer, and then, of course, provide you with some resources and have plenty of time for some Q&A. We will be using polling features throughout this presentation just so that there's a little bit more active engagement. I know we get a little zoomed out just watching somebody on a screen. So to go ahead and set the stage a little bit here, I am going to be starting with a poll in just a moment here, but the topics we're really talking about, and these are universal challenges when living with cancer. There's unwanted aloneness, financial burden, loss of hope, loss of control, and then living with uncertainty. So Amy, if you could go ahead and launch our first poll today. Just want to know today, as you're watching this webinar, which of these really resonates most with you today? A lot of quick responses coming in. This is great. We'll see if we can get up to 75%. We're just about there. I think we might have hit our low. Amy, I don't know if attendees can see the results. Is there a way to share that?
They should be able to.
Okay, so as you can all see then, there's just a wide variety of feelings, these different challenges that everybody's resonating with today. A lot of living with uncertainty, unwanted aloneness. Of course, there's always that financial burden, loss of hope, and loss of control.
Okay, I think now people can see. If anybody wants to share it in the chat, if you can see the results now. Perfect.
Great. Well, that was just to get do some level setting to see how we're all feeling today. So we can go ahead and proceed with the slides and stop sharing the poll. This next slide that I have up comes from our Cancer Experience Registry. It's a tool through Cancer Support Community that's been developed by our Research and Training Institute. And what it does is it provides a forum for anyone impacted by cancer to share their voice about issues that matter to them. It helps them connect with each other and ensures that their experiences are communicated to a broader cancer community. And the goal is to really make a difference in how people move through their cancer journey. So this data comes from our 2020 registry, and it's just the top 10 concerns across the entire registry that people had. You can see eating and nutrition, is up there pretty high. Cancer progression or coming back, worrying about the future and what lays ahead. These are all different things that are going to come into play with how positive we're feeling, negative or positive, or how positive we're portraying our feelings during a cancer diagnosis. I just want to highlight here a few stats from that registry report. 49% of respondents were at risk for clinically significant levels of anxiety. Likewise, 38% of respondents were at risk for clinically significant levels of depression. So it's important to note, this is saying that they are at risk. We do not do any clinical diagnosis of anxiety or depression, but as you can see, it's not uncommon at all for somebody who's impacted by cancer, whether they're the patient or the caregiver, to have these feelings of anxiety and depression. Some more interesting stats for you. 49% felt that their anxiety was worse than the national average. 34% reported that their fatigue was worse than the national average. And 39% said that their health was somewhat worse or much worse than before they began a caregiving role. So this is what we're hearing specifically from caregivers. So very similar stats from on the caregiver side as from the person diagnosed side. And it really can take a great toll on health for the caregiver if they're not addressing their own physical and mental needs during a loved one's cancer diagnosis. I once had a participant in a support group say that they had been having some vision issues and heart issues, and they just kept putting off their doctor's appointment. And when you do that, it's understandable. You want to, as a caregiver, devote all of your time as much as you can to the person with the diagnosis. But when you're putting off your own needs, you're joining that 39% who say that their health is worse or much worse when they became a caregiver. And if you're not addressing some of these health needs in the immediate future, when your loved one really needs you, if there's a progression, if they get to a point where they're in an end of life or hospice situation, then you're going to probably wish you had taken care of yourself so that you had that energy at those critical times. And again, that living with uncertainty, 53% of our cancer experience registry respondents indicated that they're worried about the future and what lies ahead. So that means putting plans on hold, that fear that the treatment will stop working or that it won't work. There's a lot of uncertainty that comes into play here. And I just want you to think a little bit about what on this slide resonates most with you. What depletes your resources? Is it unmanaged distress, untreated depression, unrecognized grief, limited social support? Just take a moment to think about which of these resonates most with you today. And I keep saying today because I realize our feelings change so frequently when we're experiencing cancer. So I've already said the word distress several times, and you're going to hear me refer to it several more throughout this presentation. But when I'm talking about distress, I'm talking about a mix of anxiety and depressive symptoms, and they may cause things like sleepiness, loss of appetite, trouble concentrating, difficulty carrying on regular activities. And we know that some level of distress is normal, but about a third of cancer patients experience significant distress. Only about 5% of those with cancer obtain psychological help, though, for this distress. So while distress doesn't affect the cancer itself per se, it does affect how patients and caregivers cope with cancer. And it can also impact the ability for somebody to follow up with treatment recommendations. So we know that distress has predictable points. When the diagnosis first happens, when there's a treatment decision to be made, when a scan is coming up, it causes that scanxiety feeling of anxiety. And then, of course, anytime there's a progression of the cancer. So this next tool that I have up on the screen, it's just a little brief glimpse at our cancer support source distress screening tool. So this is something that we use to just gauge it's a snapshot of time. It could change tomorrow depending on how you're feeling, but we use it to kind of identify immediate distressors in somebody's life, whether they're the patient, the survivor, or a caregiver. So I'm going to have Amy share our next poll here. And what I'd like you to do is, while you're looking at the questions on this screen, just kind of grab a piece of scrap paper and think about how many you would consider as being moderately to very seriously concerned about. So we'll go ahead and give you a moment to fill this out. And again, we can't see who's submitting what. We can't even see what you're responding to. We're just looking at ranges of numbers. And we'll share the results in a moment here once a few more people have a chance to respond. I know it's a lot to think about. Looks like we slowed down quite a bit. So Amy, you can probably go ahead and share those responses. You're on it. So not surprising, nobody answered none. We are all feeling some sort of distress in our life, which is part of why I used this slide to help normalize the conversation. But you can see that there's a wide variety. And again, this tool is a snapshot in time. So this is how you're currently feeling. In an hour, you could take this and it could look slightly different depending on what happens between now and then. But I think that gives us all, just illustrates the point that we all carry distress with us when cancer is in part of our lives. I think we can stop sharing and move on with the slides. All right, and I just want to, there's going to be several points throughout this presentation where I just like to remind you, if you are having health concerns that you want to talk to your doctor, make sure that you're asking for support and resources that you can use in the community that you're located in. All right, so the burden of positive thinking. I know you can all read this for yourself, but I'm going to read it anyway. It's bad enough to have cancer, but when all your family and friends are saying that you have to be positive and you have to fight this thing, and the patient is exhausted and beaten up by treatment, it seems to me that adding that burden to be positive was just ridiculous. So I think this is, again, you're all here for a workshop called Why Can't I Stay Positive? So this has definitely impacted you in some sort of way. There's a lot of different myths and worries that cancer patients and caregivers have, that negative thinking can cause recurrence, it can cause progression, but there's really no evidence that shows a high level optimism prior to treatment enhanced anyone's survival rate. So encouraging patients to be positive might only add to that burden of having cancer while providing very little benefit. And this came from a study of patients with non-small cell carcinoma. But you can't take care of yourself if you're trying to stay positive for everybody else around you. So what's so burdensome about trying to stay positive all the time? It's the fact that it provides an ability to acknowledge that cancer is a difficult and frightening experience. It takes away that fear from us, but not in a good way. Fear is something that we need to work through and deal with. There's that insistence that you have to always put on a happy face for the people around you. When you're the one who has the cancer diagnosis, or you're perhaps the caregiver whose loved one has this diagnosis. Being positive kind of gives that feeling of guilt because you're unable to always be positive. And there's just a wide range of emotions that people seem to think are unacceptable. So trying to compound all this along with your cancer diagnosis can be really difficult and unrealistic. So what we're going to do is just take a few moments here. I'm going to look at my watch and give you a few minutes to reflect. But in your experience with cancer, have you ever felt pressure to think happy, put a smile on your face, or find silver lining in all of this? So just think about what that's looked like for you in your own life for a few minutes.
Please repeat the reflection one more time.
The reflection is just, have you felt pressure to think happy, put a smile on your face, or find a silver lining in any of this? And while you're all still thinking about that, I'm going to have Amy go ahead and launch another poll. So this is just asking you, how often do you feel pressure to think positively about you or your loved one's cancer diagnosis? I'm going to give people just another moment to answer. Amy, it looks like it's slowed down. We can probably go ahead and share the results. So some of you always feel this pressure. A lot of you often or sometimes, a few rarely's in there, but nobody has acknowledged that they never feel this way. So it is something that's a bit of a constant, whether we're the person with a cancer diagnosis, a caregiver, And I'm sure we have some people on the call here today who are bereaved due to their loved one dying from their cancer. So we can go ahead and stop sharing and move forward. And we're going to be talking about depression next. So we all face depressive moments in our life. To diagnostically be diagnosed with depression, you have to be experiencing 5 or more symptoms of depression during a 2-week program or 2-week period of time. And at least one of these symptoms would either be a depressive mood, a loss of interest or pleasure. So some of these symptoms are you're depressed most of the day, nearly every day. You're markedly diminished. You have little interest or pleasure in things that you used to. There could be significant weight loss when you're not dieting, or on the opposite end, significant weight gain. A lot of us choose to cope through eating. I'm one of those. A slowing down of thought and a reduction of physical movement that others in our lives can also observe. Another sign of depression is a fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. Feelings of worthlessness or excessive and inappropriate guilt nearly every day. Recurrent thoughts of death or recurrent suicidal ideation without a specific plan or suicide attempts. And then to receive a diagnosis of depression, these symptoms must have caused you clinically significant distress or impairment in your social, occupational, or other important areas of your life. So these symptoms also are not a result of substance abuse or other medical conditions. So it can be a little bit difficult to diagnose. The main thing to remember here is that only a licensed mental health professional or medical professional on your care team can diagnose you with depression. So if you think that these symptoms are frequent and relevant, please be sure that you're talking to your healthcare team about them more. But again, I mentioned that all of us have felt depression at some point in our life, even though we're not necessarily clinically diagnosed with it. So we're going to talk a little bit about how it feels. There's mood-related symptoms, feeling sad, hopeless, irritable, numb, worthless, and down. There's physical symptoms related to depression. Just to show that it's much more than mood related, it can cause fatigue, appetite loss, insomnia, which is when you're not able to fall asleep and stay asleep, hypersomnia, which is feeling very sleepy most of the time throughout your day. And it can even lead to sexual problems or lower sexual desire. There's behaviors affected by being depressed. So again, it's that loss of interest in activities that you usually enjoy. It can be frequent crying, withdrawal from family and friends, loss of motivation for your normal daily activities. And then there's the cognitive symptoms. So in extreme situations, these may include thoughts that life's not worth living or thoughts of even hurting yourself. They would be persistent thoughts. So it can also cause memory problems, just trouble focusing and making decisions that were usually easy to make, and then just experiencing a lot of negative thoughts. So we know that it's common to feel depressed. In fact, 1/3 of cancer patients report a mood disorder at some point after diagnosis. And with the first year after diagnosis, this is when it poses the greatest risk. And then between 10 and 20% of cancer patients continue to report depression and anxiety after the initial stress of diagnosis or recurrence. More than half of cancer patients and survivors report fatigue as being an ongoing issue. And a large number of survivors continue to struggle with pain and isolation. So again, if these are things that you are feeling on a persistent basis, make sure that you're talking to your oncologist, your primary care provider, your oncology social worker, nurse navigator, someone to that effect about your mental health concerns. So again, knowing that this is a common occurrence, we also know that depression can impact quality of life. It can decrease adherence to cancer treatment. If you're having trouble just getting out of bed for the day, it's logical to think you'd have trouble getting yourself to a doctor appointment. It can lead to longer hospital stays. 38% of respondents said that they were substantially worse levels of anxiety than the national average, and 26 reported that they had substantially worse levels of depression than the national average. So again, tell your healthcare team about any of these concerns and ask them for support and resources. That can include individual counseling, medications, joining a support group. There's a lot of different ways that we can address depression. Another thing we know about depression, it's treatable. So it can be treated in a lot of different factors. Many patients really benefit if they take a variety of approaches to treatment. That can include relaxation strategies, psychoeducation, cognitive behavioral therapy, problem-solving therapy, and acceptance and commitment therapy. So if you're wondering what the heck some of those are, CBT, or cognitive behavioral theory, that identifies and equips patients with skills to overcome maladaptive thoughts and patterns, and it encourages emotional readjustment. So both psychoeducation and CBT have been demonstrated to be effective in improving depressive symptoms and quality of life. And then acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, it teaches patients how to tolerate difficult thoughts without being overwhelmed or dominated by them. And then it helps develop psychological flexibility. ACT has also been demonstrated to be equivalent in CBT in terms of its effect on mood and quality of life as well. So the great news, again, is that depression is treatable. We just need to be persistent in making sure that we're talking to our healthcare providers about the fact that we're having any of these symptoms. And there still, unfortunately, is a really large stigma about having depression. I think that's one of the, we talked about silver linings earlier. That's a silver lining of the pandemic. I think it got people to open up and talk more about the fact that mental health is a concern for many of us. So you can also treat depression with medications as either in addition to or in substitute to some of the therapies I was talking about. But any combination of therapy and meds can be effective. Again, it's up to your healthcare provider to decide what's best for you. Sometimes medications, though, aren't a good fit for you because they could counteract any of your cancer treatment medications. It's very normal to seek treatment, including medications for mental health during cancer, during caregiving, and other periods of distress. So make sure that you're talking to your healthcare team again. But there's different types of medication that can be antidepressants that can be used. Your doctor is going to decide what fits best for you based on your specific needs, any potential side effects it might have. They'll look at other medications that you're taking, and they'll look at your medical history. The selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, those are generally first line for treatment of depression and cancer patients. And that's mainly because they're more tolerable. Some people, it can take up to 2 weeks to start feeling any effect or feeling a difference from your antidepressant medication. But generally, it can take 6 to 8 weeks for medications to feel their full effect. So in other words, give it time to work. If it's not working for you, though, that needs to be communicated back to your healthcare team. Some medication is particularly effective for improving moods and physical symptoms associated with major depressive disorders. So sometimes adding psychological treatment to medications might be helpful for managing those negative thoughts. and low self-esteem and finding better coping strategies. We're going to move on to talking about grief and cancer. And I really love this quote on the next screen. We shake with joy, we shake with grief. What a time they have, these two housed as they are in the same body. So we have the same physical manifestations to grief as we do to joy, which can lead to some feelings of confusion. There are a lot of different types of grief. So one form of grief is called living loss. This represents how we may experience chronic or ongoing sorrow. It's that space between what is and what should have been. So this is where you might capture how you thought you'd be spending the rest of your point in the rest of your life at this point in time, compared to in reality, how you're going to be spending it due to cancer and its after effects. So that could be, as a young adult, my husband and I found out that fertility was going to be a huge barrier for us in our early marriage. And so that was definitely living loss for us. Another form of grief is called ambiguous loss. So this is a type of grief that involves a sense of loss that's maybe unclear and defies resolution. You just have that gut feeling that there's some sort of loss, but not really able to describe exactly what it is. And so it can make things much more complicated. Cancer also results in what's called loss of the assumptive world. So this is typically when, growing up, we develop a sense of the world and kind of have assumptions about if we lead a good life, that'll mean that there's good things for us. We work hard, we're a good person, we'll have a good life. So these sorts of beliefs can form in our core. They can lead to beliefs about ourselves and what we expect to happen in our lives. But when we face illness or struggle, these beliefs can really be challenging and can feel disorienting. We might even feel stuck trying to make sense of this grief and work through it. And as I'm talking about these different types of grief can happen at any point. It can happen when the diagnosis occurs, if there's progression of the cancer, if there's metastasis. And then, of course, once we have grief when somebody has died from their cancer. But another type of grief is called disenfranchised grief. So that's when our grief is invalidated or minimized, or even just not publicly acknowledged. We might feel a sense of loss that's not recognized by people around us. For instance, when people say you should just be happy that you're alive, rather than expressing or understanding why someone might be sad that their cancer treatment has pushed them, into menopause. It might have prevented them from having children, or it just leads you to not feeling good and feeling crummy all day. So this type of invalidation over what is considered appropriate or an inappropriate sense of loss, it can come from significant others, friends, healthcare professionals even, but in general, it might be something that we internalize and try to take away from allowing ourselves to feel grief. There's also complicated grief. Losing a loved one, it is one of the most distressing and unfortunately common experiences people face. Most people who experience normal grief and bereavement have a period of sorrow, of numbness, guilt, anger even. Gradually, these feelings start to ease. They can still be a bit debilitating, but they're easier to cope with over time. But it's when it becomes debilitating and there's no improvement that it becomes known as complicated grief. And sometimes it's called persistent complex bereavement disorder. But in complicated grief, the painful emotions are just so long lasting and severe that you have trouble recovering from the loss and resuming your own life. So complicated grief is like being in an ongoing heightened sense of mourning that just keeps you from healing. And then finally, we have anticipatory grief. So if you have a loved one with an advanced cancer diagnosis, you might already be preparing yourself for their end of life. So that's one example. And then as your loved one's illness progresses, you may feel like you've already lost them as a person. Sometimes a person feels like they've lost themselves even because they lose a lot of independence and become a different person. So anticipatory grief, it shares a lot of commonalities with conventional grief, but sometimes can have unique factors too. It can be mixed in with hope that your loved one will live longer or survive their illness, while conventional grief signals that a loss has already occurred. So the National Cancer Institute defines the most common symptoms of anticipatory grief as depression, heightened concern for the ill person. It's that heightened concern that sometimes prevents a caregiver from taking care of themselves. Rehearsal for your loved one's end of life. Attempts to adjust consequences of the loved one's life. Anxiety, worry, irritability, and then just mourning changes in your loved one's personality or physical appearance can happen. So with everything I just mentioned, how complicated grief can get, it's really difficult and really just unrealistic to expect somebody to be positive all the time. But that's not the same as not being hopeful. So hope is not wishful thinking. Hope is just adjusting and adapting over time. Some people early in their diagnosis have hope that they will adhere well to treatment. They have hope that there'll be a cure. They have a hope that surgery will get rid of all the cancer. And I will say just as equally when somebody is nearing end of life, making a decision about hospice, for instance, that hope just changes. Hope is maybe no longer for a cure. Hope is for a comfortable death. It's for a good quality of life with the time that you have left. So again, it's not to be, hope is not to be confused with being overly positive. I'm going to give you some time to reflect again. I'm just being conscious of our time, so we won't take up too much time doing this one. But what are you grieving? Again, a grief can be a situation. It can be that hair loss. It can be fertility. It can be that you can't drive and you used to be able to, but your medication doesn't allow it. And perhaps on top of all of this, you are grieving the death of somebody in your life as well. So just take some time, think about what you're grieving, but also think about how you can honor and acknowledge your grief. Give you a few minutes to think on that. So what are you grieving and how can you honor and acknowledge your grief? We're going to transition here from grief to resilience. And I really believe that instead of focusing on being positive in the face of cancer, it's really resiliency that we need to focus on. So I'm going to let you read this quote on the screen for yourself this time, but there are many ways to define resilience. It can range from bouncing back from adversity to positive adaptation or growth when there's a disruption in life. Most people will agree, though, that resilience is a process It's not something you have automatically, but it's a process that begins after significant life difficulty. And it really involves a lot of ongoing re-collaboration. So there's a model of resilience that recognizes the way in which individuals experience the world before cancer affects their response and ability to cope with cancer. So in this model, mindfulness is the foundation of resilience, because mindfulness allows you to remain present in whatever challenges life presents. I just want to point out, again, in that quote, it reiterates the fact that resiliency is a process that happens over time. So there's that word again, it's an active process of facing adversity related to your cancer experience. It's not something you either have or you don't have, it's something that you work to achieve. Resiliency is the ability to restore emotional and physical functioning when confronting with stressful events. And it involves behaviors, thoughts, and actions that can be learned and developed in anyone. A lot of times we can cultivate resiliency through mindfulness. So mindfulness can help us with a wide range of physical and psychosocial outcomes that include anxiety, depression, stress, fear of recurrence, fatigue, chronic pain, difficulty sleeping, and immune function. Mindfulness has also been related to increases in perceptions of social support, optimism, and overall quality of life. So again, it's a skill that can be learned. So in this reflection, I'm going to actually walk you through a brief guided mindfulness practice. So just take a moment, find yourself a position that's comfortable. If you feel like it, go ahead and close your eyes, or maybe just a soft gaze down at the floor away from your computer screen. Take a few easy, slow breaths. And with each, trying to release any tension you might notice in your body. And just simply begin to notice your breath, feeling your stomach rise as you breathe in, lower as you breathe out. Notice the rhythm of your breath. It's only natural that your mind might begin to wander. But as it does, gently remind yourself to return your focus on your breath. Stay in this moment, gently breathing, connecting with your own breath. Allow yourself to feel whatever you're feeling and be present with your current experience. So in addition to mindfulness, meditation, there's 3 different actions that you can take daily that will help you with mindfulness. One is to look for the good. The second is to spend 10 minutes in mindful thought or reflection. And the third is to do an act of kindness. So one final poll question for the day, Amy. I want you all to just think about which of these 3 is something that you think that you can work on over the next month. And there might be multiple, but just pick one. Which do you think you could focus on over the next month? A lot of quick answers coming in. I know some of you haven't had a chance to fill it out yet, but Amy, let's go ahead and share the results. So there's a really good mix, looking for the good, 10 mindful minutes and acts of kindness that we're thinking about moving forward with. I have just a few more slides and then we'll have time for questions. Our key takeaways: distress and depression are treatable. You just have to be open to bringing those to your healthcare team's attention. Resilience can be learned and strengthened. Positive thinking is not the goal. Acknowledging grief is really important. And you don't have to do this alone. So again, cancer support community, we have some resources for you. We are in several places across the country. We have our helpline, 888-795-9355. This has both evening and weekend hours for you. We have our Frankly Speaking About Cancer educational series. We talked about Cancer Experience Registry, which is where a lot of the data I shared came from. We also have Open to Options, which is a research-proven program that is helpful if you have a fork in the road and are trying to make a treatment decision. We don't tell you what to do, but we give you guidance on formulating a good list of questions to go back to your doctor so you can make an informed decision. And we are on to our questions. I'm going to stop my screen share.
I'm going to unmute myself. Kelly, thank you so much. That is so much to think about. We had some amazing questions come in prior and some equally important questions come in during. I'm going to try and combine them. We don't have a lot of time, and to try and hit the ones that you didn't touch upon. But somebody asked, and it was also a question I had. One of the slides mentioned something called unrecognized distress. And somebody asked, is there something called subconscious stress? How do you know if you're stressed or distressed when you don't have those symptoms? Or do you need those symptoms to have that?
I think you necessarily need those symptoms to have it. It's when you have those symptoms for a persistent period of time that triggers you to know to go to a medical professional to seek advanced help. But I definitely think there is some unconscious or subconscious distress that comes into play. And that's why it's important if your doctor or healthcare team has some sort of distress screening questionnaire, sometimes it will bring to light some things that were buried under the surface for you and make you more aware that that is something that's impacting you.
Thank you. I see there are a couple of hands raised. We're not going to be unmuting anybody. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat so we can try and get it answered. Thank you. How's this for another one? Somebody says, I'm going to put a couple together. These were from caregivers. So somebody said, I have no time for grief. I need to be strong for my loved one. Another person said, how can I show empathy without feeling condescending? Every time I do, my loved one says, I don't understand. You don't understand what I'm going through. So how, from a caregiver's perspective, should we be thinking about that?
Yeah, so I think grief is something you have to make time for. If you are pushing it under the rug, you are only complicating things for yourself and actually for your loved one. There can be a lot of subconscious responses to not exploring that grief in our lives. It doesn't mean if you're the caregiver that you need to be talking about death, mortality, things like that with the person who has the diagnosis. But find yourself a support group, find yourself some friends, a good community who really understands what you're going through. My husband and I religiously attended support groups. He was in one room for people with cancer. I was another for caregivers. I have no idea what he talked about. He doesn't know what I talked about, but we both got our needs met. So there are lots of communities like that out there. And the second part was about empathy, how to be empathetic.
Yeah, every time I try and offer support, I'm told I don't understand what's happening. I couldn't possibly understand it.
I think that's where being empathetic versus sympathetic is really key, because there's no way as a caregiver we're going to understand exactly what our loved one is going through. But it's asking the person with the diagnosis to share how they're feeling, to be vulnerable and tell you what they're going through. acknowledging that sometimes, no, you're not going to get it, but be supportive if your loved one wants to be in a cancer support group where they can be around other people who are diagnosed and get that support as well.
That's great. Thank you very much. A couple of other questions have come in. So just a very quick magic bullet answer when somebody tells me I need to be positive. I need to stay positive. It's so important to stay positive.
It's going to depend on the person, your relationship, how you might respond to that. But I think sometimes it's just being vulnerable and saying, it's more important to me right now that I'm real about my feelings and express my emotions than I be positive all the time. Because I think people, they want us to be positive for their benefit, and we need to focus on ourselves, especially if you're the person with the diagnosis. So sometimes it might be turning away from a friendship for taking a short break so that you can focus on yourself. You're not there to be somebody else's cheerleader. You're there to get through the diagnosis, go through treatments, get your own support that you need. It's not your responsibility to be the cheerleader for everybody around you.
Great advice. In one of the presentations that Sharsheret does, we say, we hope that everybody has a friend or someone in their life that they can talk to honestly, but don't use a friend that does something else for you, that is willing to cook but can't hear what's going on in your mind, or is willing to give rides or things like that. Use the friend that is open to hearing your true emotions, and understand that it's a burden for someone who can't take that in.
Mm-hmm. And I unfortunately did see something pop up in the chat that I need to address. Somebody said that their support group shies away from these heavy conversations. And that's really unfortunate. If your support group is led by a licensed mental health professional, psychologist, social worker, counselor, talk to the facilitator. That is something that they should be recognizing and making everybody make sure that they feel comfortable having those heavy conversations. We have to be real, in what's going on around us. It changes day to day.
That's a very important question. Thank you for addressing it. Somebody asked a different type of question, which is, do the treatments themselves, the chemotherapy, the hormones, whatever it is, does that impact our state of mind from like a biological perspective? And what can we do to counter that?
Absolutely. And if you're noticing that you're having a lot of negative side effects, talk to your healthcare team, because they might be able to tweak your medications. It might just be something that your family needs to learn to live with. For example, 3 p.m. every day. That's when my husband's prednisone kicked in. Not being on it would have killed him sooner. So I just tried to be a little absent at 3 p.m. when I knew that he was going to be crabby because of his treatment. But absolutely, there could be something in your treatment that is causing depression and anxiety. So it's important to talk to your healthcare team about any symptoms that are really being detrimental to your quality of life.
Good reminder, when people say it's just in your mind, no, it actually isn't just in your mind. Okay, so a couple more. Let's try for one more question. And then maybe with some of the others, we'll get you to write a blog for us or something like that. Sure. So there were several questions about people dealing with advanced or metastatic disease, knowing that they've run out of treatment options, feeling like they have nothing left to give to themselves or the family around them. And so what can they do with that grief, which is so warranted? How can they make, this time of their life as strong and happy or meaningful as possible?
Yeah, I think that is first going to involve identifying what quality of life looks like for you. Because once you have kind of a list of things that mean quality of life in your mind, you're going to have some things that you can focus on. You can let people know that instead of treatment, possibly you are focusing on doing X, Y, and Z because it brings you joy, and you want to be able to spend time with your friends and family. So I do think it stems from knowing what quality of life looks like for you. and trying to engage your loved ones in conversations about what that means, asking them what quality of life means for them as well. Don't make it a dialogue, a monologue, I'm sorry, make it a dialogue between two people. A lot of times we're afraid to hear what somebody else is thinking. So if we're sharing in that vulnerability, it can make those conversations a little bit easier.
Thank you. I think that's incredibly helpful advice. I want to thank you. I wish we had time for more questions. We did get a ton of questions about COVID, so I just want to point out that many organizations like Sharsheret, like Cancer Support Community or Gilda's Club, have stepped up their types of support and their levels of support, because whether one is facing cancer or not, COVID has definitely made life difficult, both physically and from an emotional or psychosocial perspective for all of us. So we'll try and get some more information to you about that as well. But now I want to thank Kelly for sharing her both professional expertise and personal experiences. I actually found your presentation very hopeful, and I hope you guys did as well. Once again, thank you to Cancer Support Community for partnering on this important webinar. Thank you to AZI, GSK, Merck, CGen, the Sigmund and Edith Blumenthal Memorial Fund. Our evaluation survey has been posted in the chat box several times. You can even click it now and fill it out as you listen to the last few moments of it. It's really important to us. We use those to create new content and programs, so we'd be very grateful for that. A reminder that Sharsheret is here for you and your loved ones during this time, and we provide emotional support, mental health counseling, and other programs, all designed to help you navigate the cancer experience. They're all free, confidential, and one-on-one. Our email address is in the chat box. You can reach us by just emailing us at clinicalstaff@sharsheret.org, because our social workers are available to each of you. You are our priority, your health, your well-being, and we're going to get through this together. And finally, I wanted to let you know that if the idea of resiliency really resonated with you and you want to hear more, we have an amazing program next week with Dr. Edith Eger. And it is part of our book club, but you most certainly do not have to have read the book ahead of time. She is a psychologist who is also a Holocaust survivor and has spoken significantly about resiliency for a variety, not just Holocaust, but for illness, for lots of things about resiliency in life. And then if you're looking for another way to reduce stress, just a couple of days later, we have a combination of our Sharsheret in the Kitchen program and our Shalom Shabbat program. We're going to do a challah making presentation, because challah making actually can be very meditative, and that's a way to reduce stress and anxiety. And those links are in our chat box, and we will do our best to answer all the questions that did not yet get answered. I want to thank you for joining us today. Again, thank you, Kelly. And we look forward to connecting with you on another webinar. Thank you very much.